what's going on in this passage. It seems on the face of it that it's basically just a rammy between Paul and Peter. So it's quite a tricky one. It requires a lot of background, but I'll do my best to fill you in and also to extract some meaning from it for what the gospel means in our lives today. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, pick your battles. And it's probably been said to you when you're in a place where you're not really picking them very wisely. I remember when I worked in television, when you were making a TV program, you would get towards the end of it, and then the producer, the producer, you were director, and then the producer would come in, and they would sit in and watch it, and they would have to have something to say. So they would quite often say, I want you to lose that bit or get rid of that bit. And of course, you would be quite precious about the whole thing because you'd spent weeks assembling it, and you would really have to pick your battles. You would have to decide ahead of time, I know they're going to want to take various chunks out of it, so I'm willing to let them lose these bits, but this bit or this scene, I'm going to fight for that because I stood in the pouring rain for 4 hours to get that shot or whatever it was. But you had to do that. And we all know what that's like in negotiating life and having to have connections and relationships or working relationships with other people. You need to decide what's worth going to war over and what you can kind of allow to let slide. And Paul is pretty vehement in this bit because for him, the stuff that Peter and the other Jewish believers are getting wrong is something that he's not willing to let slide. So he's picking a massive fight over this. Why? Because for him, the gospel, the good news of what Jesus has come to the world to do is central and it's essential. And the stuff that they're doing in this situation is actually detracting from that. And as far as he's concerned, there's a very real danger that it's going to affect the lives and future generations of what people believe and even the access people have to come and be a part of this Christian community. So yes, he's raging, but I hope that you'll see that it's for a good reason as we consider why what Paul sees as the gospel, why it's actually worth fighting for. Remember last week that we found in Galatia, which is in modern-day South Turkey, that a whole group of people who were kind of in the Jewish faith, they became believers in Jesus, and they started putting their stock in this traveling rabbi who'd been killed and everyone was claiming he'd been raised again from the dead. And that was causing problems because Judaism was a kind of state-sanctioned religion, and it was now starting to attract more attention, and there was a question over, well, if people think this Jesus and his followers, if it's a new religion, it might not get the special protection. So the Jewish people were pretty irate, and they were starting to try and manipulate it so that they would keep more Jewish customs in order to keep themselves politically safe, if you like. And the tension has come when we read in this passage because in this little group of believers, Paul's basically calling out that there's spies in it. There's people who've come who they don't even believe in the whole Jesus thing. They don't take it seriously. They've just pretended that they did so they could come in and they could say, see that Paul guy, what he was saying to you about not needing to be circumcised and not having to worry about food laws, that's not right at all. And they were stirring the pot, if you like, which is why Paul's got a real mess on his hands. And worse than that, Peter, we all know Peter, he was one of the disciples. He was the disciple who denied Jesus 3 times, but he was also the disciple who Jesus said, you're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. He had actually kind of fallen under this a wee bit. So Peter had started out by just eating with the non-Jewish people. Remember, food laws are a really big deal in Judaism because from their point of view, people who aren't Jews are worshipping idols and taking part in a system of idolatry. So if you eat with them, then you're by association kind of contaminated by their idolatrousness. And so Peter had started kind of believing, oh, actually, it's a new day, all of that is over, even with the Gentiles. And he drew back from that, which is really why you end up with this tension. Paul is saying you're out of bounds. So there's no integrity to what you're doing here. So the temptation for us in the 21st century is to go, my goodness, do they not just all need to chill out a wee bit? Thinking about food laws and circumcision and stuff that we don't think about at all. But let's try and get the principles behind what Paul's fighting for, and if we can figure out why is this gospel, what we call the gospel, why is it worth fighting for anyway? I'm going to propose to you that it's worth fighting for because, well, firstly, according to Paul, it is the Lord's work, not ours or anyone else's. And then secondly, it's worth fighting for because it acts as an antidote to our prejudices. Acts as an antidote to our prejudices, which we're going to see. It's also worth fighting for because it gives us a straight line to walk as believers in the world, as people who are part of the Christian community. And also, it's worth fighting for because it makes the world a better place. I've got 4 points today rather than 3, so I assure you they're all shorter than usual. Firstly, it's worth fighting for because it is the Lord's work. It's a casual phrase that we have in our culture now of somebody is doing the Lord's work, and also that it shouldn't be being gate-kept. Nobody should be gatekeeping it, according to Paul. And I'm going to kind of go to the end of his argument, and then we're going to go back and tease out the implications, because in verses 19 and 20, he says, I died to the law so that I might live for God. And then he says, I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. I live by faith in the Son of God who loved himself and gave himself for me, and I do not set aside the grace of God. Now, for Paul and for me, and I hope you'll agree with me, this is where everything starts in the good news of what Christianity is all about. It is not a program or a series of steps that you can follow in order to feel a bit more holy or to tidy up and sort out your life. Hopefully that comes as a benefit of Christianity, that your life and things generally do get better. But it's not actually centrally what it's all about. And I think if we get off on the wrong foot, then we don't understand it. Paul says, I do not set aside the grace of God. He's saying that if you get this wrong and you think it's about how we arrange our religious sort of outlook and practices here in the world, then we're forgetting that we're all only in this position to be here thinking about faith because God himself did something. You see, the grace of God, a phrase that rolls off our lips so easily on church, is about God being disposed favorably towards a group of people that nobody's forced him to. He's just decided, because of who he is and his infinite love, that he will set that love on people and reveal it to them and show it to them. And not in an empty way or through any platitudes. First comes his initiative, and then what he does is, I love the way N.T. Wright, the bishop in the Church of England, puts this. He says, one thing that you could do is say, I love you, so I'll send somebody else to die for you, to show the love. That doesn't show love. What does show love? I love you, so I will die for you. And that's exactly what happens within the Trinitarian God. God sends his only Son in order to die in Paul's place, and he's saying by extension in the whole community's place, and so in all of our place. So there's tangible evidence and a clear demonstration of that love. Do you know how much he loved you? He gave himself for you, according to Paul. He loved me and he gave himself for me. And it starts there, because if it starts anywhere else of, okay, I'm feeling a bit more religious, or I'm starting to work more religion into my life, or any of that, then eventually we're going to get tangled up of, well, actually, I don't feel that way anymore. Or actually, I'm not able to keep practicing that in the same way. But if you start with the love and the grace of God, it engulfs your entire life and experience of walking on this road, because that fact never changes. That, for Paul, is the absolutely unshakable foundation of what the whole of this good news actually looks like. That's why he wants to keep pushing it out and shouting it to more and more people groups. He's saying, look, The Son of God has come and he's loved you and given himself for you, because he can keep saying that to more and more groups of people, because he can keep filling up the table of God with that, because there are more and more people always who need to hear that message, because it is such a beautiful encapsulation of what they most need in their heart. That God has actually noticed me and that he has set his love on me, and even more than that, that he has died for me. He's given himself for me. And there's no amount of effort that I can do. He says I'm dead to the law, or trying to keep a certain subset of rules in order to win God's favor. What would be the point in that when he's already loved me and given himself for me? And what would be the point in that for you and me when he's assuring us, I've already loved you and I've given myself for you? So starting the gospel with God's self-giving, with God's grace, it is the Lord's work. It is him who has done all of this. None of us can add anything to it. And so, by extension, why is Paul going so mad about this, about who's in and who's out? He's saying because it's not your prerogative. It's not your place to say who is and who isn't a Christian and who's in and who's out in this circumstance, because you don't agree with the particular laws that they're keeping or not keeping. How dare you? He's saying to them. This is the Lord's work. You're not here to gatekeep it. You would probably do a bad job of it even if you tried. You might be surprised at who God is choosing to work in their lives and their hearts and draw him to himself. But God doesn't care about that, and neither do I. Good, I hope you should be surprised, because if you could fully comprehend and understand this message, and if it made a nice, tidy sense in your mind, then it probably wouldn't be God anyway. Because by its very nature, the gospel has always been bringing a kind of scandalous side to it because of God's radical inclusion of people that the religious establishment just didn't think would fit in very well. And I'm actually desperate to reach people with this message, because I think there are so many people that exclude themselves. And I actually see it in conversations I have from week to week, that, sometimes I'll speak to people and they'll say, I wouldn't mind coming to church, but I think my head will spin backwards when I go in, or I'll burst into flames. I get that all the time. And I want to say, based on what Paul's saying here, no, you are exactly the sort of person that should and could and should find yourself coming into church, because you would be a good example of who the gospel is actually for. It is the Lord's work, and it's not for me to gatekeep it. And it's a shame that you think you would burst into flames, because God has loved you and given himself for you. And we should be unashamed in proclaiming that, because it is his work and not ours. It's his work and not ours. And then secondly, it's worth fighting for because it's an antidote to prejudice. Now, Paul doesn't miss and hit the wall in verse 14. When I saw they were not acting in line, I said to Cephas, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force the Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? Well, he's saying, firstly, you're a complete hypocrite, because you're now drawing back from eating with people who aren't Jews unless they kind of do the correct hand washing and so on. You see, the Jewish people saw people who wouldn't do those rituals and rules as a kind of contaminant. They would think that by associating with them, they were going to get contaminated. And we actually have a good illustration of this from the last few years. We all knew what it was to have especially in the early days of the pandemic, the fear and the suspicion that anybody you saw walking around could be a carrier of this disease that we didn't have a vaccine for in the early days, and that we didn't exactly know where it came from or how it would behave or what the exact mortality rate was or how sick you were likely to get. And so you had that slight suspicion. Do you remember? And you quite often see, everyone had a different level of comfort, but you would often see people with their body language drawing back a little bit, and we probably all did that to some extent. And then we ended up with this real kind of chaos of some people who thought it was more serious than others, and it was really difficult to walk that line, because we thought anybody could be contaminated. And there's a worse problem than that in the world, because disease is awful. And this week alone, there's been amazing breakthroughs. There's been a breakthrough in a drug that's been tested on animals to cure cancer, and it goes after the specific cancer-causing proteins, but it leaves the rest of the healthy ones alone. And then there was another one in Alzheimer's, which goes after the faulty DNA. And again, it's only been tested in animals. We're years and years away probably from it being widely available to the public. But when you hear that on the news, you feel something uplifted, because you know the stories, either your own experience or of others, and how much trial and trauma it causes. And you think, man, if there was a cure for that, that would just be wonderful. And yet, the rest of the news cycle is often filled with the even worse problem of the prejudice in the human heart, of people, man and woman's inhumanity to their fellow man and woman, of people being so suspicious that other people are contaminated and are the wrong sort of person, that they have open and hostile warfare, and they go all out to war, nation against nation, people and tribe against each other, communities against each other, football teams against each other. But that runs all the way through our human ancestry, and there's no generation that's been able to do much to be able to sort it out. Imagine just that feeling that you get when you hear that there's a cure for a really pernicious disease. Imagine if there was a cure for the prejudice that we hold in the human heart, for the suspicion with which we hold others who are not like us, for the arm's length that we keep people that stops us having a real sense of community, and that's worse than ever in our world now. Imagine if there was an antidote to that. There is. And that's why Paul is fighting Peter about this, because he's saying, you are supposed to have experienced and tasted the antidote, the final antidote to all prejudice in this world, because you're supposed to walk with the conviction that you weren't worthy of God's love, but he set his love on you anyway. And he forgave you of all your sin, and he redeemed you and gave you a new life. And that is what gives you this humility, but it's also what gives you a deep appreciation for others. And it gives you the potential to see everyone through that lens as another image bearer of God who can be redeemed and transformed by his love. And instead, you are saying, actually, I'm of a different sort to you. I won't eat with you because you're probably quite contaminated in a different way than I am. You're meant to understand that the gospel is this great equalizer that should absolutely neutralize all that prejudice and take it away and enable us to build bridges. Why does this matter for you and me? Because the way we act is how people see what the gospel actually looks like as Christians and people in the church. And if we have that suspicion and draw back and keep to our own kind and all of that, then the message for people is, right, okay, that's for certain kinds of people and not for others. And so there's a difference quite often between what we say and what we actually practice. But the best advert that we can give for the gospel is saying, look, this is the best news that we've ever heard, and here's a way to show it. It's removed all our prejudices, just our prejudging someone or something before we get to know them. It's destroyed that and it's pulled it down, meaning we see everybody through the lens of someone who bears God's image and who God is waiting to fill with his love. Can you imagine a world where people walked with that conviction and where they acted out of that? What does it look like? It looks like the passages in the Old Testament that say the glory of the Lord shall fill the world as the waters cover the sea, where nation will no more rise up against nation. Do you know how we get there? Well, in some small part, by you and I acting out the gospel and taking seriously the fact that it's an antidote to our prejudices, because the Son of God loved himself and gave himself for us. But also it gives us, in the same verse, it gives us this straight line to walk in verse 14. When I saw they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. And it's very similar to the previous point, but it's a different way of looking at it. What did I do? I said, you're a Jew, but you live like a Gentile and not a Jew. So why are you forcing the Gentiles to follow these customs? see that line, he says, they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. Acting in line, another way to translate it would be they were not walking a straight line according to what the gospel had given them. The Greek word behind it is actually where we get our whole word for orthopedics, because it's got that kind of imaginative quality of it's to do with being able to correct something and help somebody to walk in a straight line where perhaps previously they couldn't. And Paul is reminding them and Peter that it's remarkably simple. And it reminded me this week of what Jesus himself said, that the path to life is a kind of narrow and straight way, and broad is the way to destruction. And I loved studying this week, because I thought, okay, all of that isn't so much about the rules that you keep and your personal morality and piety. It's actually the table that you sit at and the people that you associate with. Do you see? He's getting at them because they were walking a crooked way by going, okay, I'll eat with these guys and I'll share fellowship with them, and then I won't because some people over there are putting pressure on me, and okay, well, maybe I'll eat with them if other people don't see it and don't know anything about it. And he's saying, the gospel is the Son of God having come into the world and given himself for sinners in order that they might believe in him. Or again, as N.T. Wright puts it, the gospel is God's power offering to salvation to anyone who believes. Son of God gave himself for them. And so to then start fiddling about with it and saying, oh, it kind of applies here, but it doesn't apply here, and I'll eat with them. And he's saying, you're not walking a straight line. That's completely crooked. And it's not so much about what we do or the rules that we keep, but it's about the fellowship that we keep. Are you willing to do what Jesus did, and as he got accused of, eat with publicans and prostitutes and sinners? Are you willing to do that? Because if you're not, and you're keeping it, then that's crooked. It gives them a straight line to walk, and it's incredibly simple, but it can be hard. It's profound, but at the same time, it's not complicated. Because in order to walk God's way, and people, how do I walk God's way? How do I find his path and his will for my life? And how do I know that I'm doing that? Well, it should be you should be straight as a die. You should not be duplicitous. And you should be willing to do what God has done for you. You should be willing to do for others, is to set a table for them, even if they're very different, even if they're famously sinful and reprobate. You know, it's such a radical message. And he's saying, don't you dare mess it up and skew it. And, you know, newsflash, the church has done that for hundreds and thousands of years. We've been gatekeeping, and we've added lots of prerequisites and add-ons and addendums to what it looks like to actually belong to God and who we can associate with and all of that. Why? Because we're obsessed with building our own power structure. And we find this actually too radical and too hard to do. It doesn't mean that we stop trying, and it doesn't mean that we should stop preaching this amazing message of a straight road where we'll associate with anyone, because we have this radical understanding that God has loved us and given himself for us, and so we want to show that love to anyone else. And it's that straight and that straightforward. And lastly, gospel's worth fighting for because it is the Lord's work, because it's an antidote to our prejudice, because it gives us the straight line to walk, but lastly, because it makes the world a better place. And that is our genuine hope as people who've tasted this goodness of God and believe in it and take part in church life. All the way back in verse 9 and 10, Paul's kind of recapping where he's been, and the fact that he was in Jerusalem and taking part in church meetings and councils, and just showing his own biography of, look, I've been living this stuff out from the start. And he's saying, look, the guys at that who are in charge of the church there, they agreed with me that we should go to people who don't keep the particular Jewish rules. We shouldn't force them to be circumcised or keep the dietary laws. All they asked, and he agreed with, was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I'd been eager to do all along. And this runs through the DNA of God's message and good news and his people all the way through the Old Testament and into the New and here. And it actually unifies the people who are more of a Jewish persuasion and Paul, who's really grasped the radical new vision of what the gospel's like. We should care for the poor. And so often, particularly in evangelical Christianity, it can be said as the gospel is about how you get saved and how you make sure you go to heaven when you die, and it's about your personal soul. And then we can do, and maybe we should do, good works like take care of the poor, but that's all very separate. And what I loved about studying this week was seeing, actually, this is all one of a piece. This is all part of the same thing. Because just like who we will eat with and associate with is our way of visibly demonstrating the work that God has done within us, so our concern for people who are in difficulty and hardship and going through difficult times is a visible and valuable demonstration, once again, of the power of what God has done in our lives. I opened our service today by reading from Psalm 72. In fact, there's an even more potent verse, a couple of verses in it, which is a kind of a prophetic psalm about what the world will look like when God is ruling it as the rightful king. And there's perfect peace and justice. And it says it'll look like this in verse 12. For he will deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He will take pity on the weak and the needy and save them from death. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. There can be a view that the good that we try to do in the church, it's just anemic, it's do-gooderism, it's us trying to make ourselves feel better about ourselves. And I don't accept any of that, because it's central and it's worth fighting for, this caring for the poor, because it's as important as all the other parts of the gospel. It's quite often the touchstone and the touch point of how people know who we are and how the fact that we belong to God and we actually love the world that we're in, because we're willing to do that, sometimes at personal or even great personal cost to ourselves. But let me reinforce for you how important it is, but also how amazing it is that we get to take part in that. That's a vision for what we all believe is going to happen. God will remake the heavens and the earth, and he will rule, and his glory will cover the world. And that doesn't mean like, a one world government like we often hear about in the news that people might want to do, and there'll be some awful dictator or group of dictators at the top of it. It will be a God who is love and who will rule in perfect peace and justice. And part of that and what it looks like is the poor and the most oppressed will be taken care of, and that's central to God's vision of what a good world looks like. If that's central to his vision, then surely that is part of the good news of the kingdom that Jesus came to bring. And for Paul, it started when Jesus died and was resurrected again and seated at the right hand of God. But he was saying, look, this has started, this new age, this new rule, as we thought about last week. And so right now, bit by bit, as the people who follow that message and that person, we get to do our part in seeing the glory of God spread out and fill the world. How? By simple acts of doing the good wherever we can, of helping people who find themselves oppressed and in difficulty, and showing them love and kindness. And it's not do-gooderism, and it's not pointless, or it's not just a flyby where it does a little help that day. And it not only helps, but it's part of Paul's vision of the gospel. It's part of a gospel that's worth fighting for, because we would all agree that we want to see the world be a better place. Well, it's not just us that agree on that. It is God that wants to do that, and he has called us into a community that is to, in however small a part, push that forward and see that vision become a reality. I hope with me this morning you've seen that there are many more, but there are at least 4 good reasons that the gospel is worth fighting for, and why it is truly the best news that the world has ever heard. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.